Hello and welcome to the People, Place and Nature podcast. This week we're joined by Dusty Gedge and we'll be talking about how we make cities green. I don't mean all that sustainability and technology stuff, I mean literally, how do we get plants and trees onto buildings? And how do we need to rethink the city as a whole to be able to achieve this and how it functions? Well, I really enjoyed this episode and I hope you do too. Hello, we're here today coming from a very variable London, looking at an incredible green roof with Dusty Gedge here. He's the president of the European Green Roof Federation of Green Roof and Wall Associations.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, and a board member of the trade body GROW here in the UK.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, well, so let's just sort of explain all that. GROW, the Green Roof Organisation, is the UK's green roof trade body. And the federation is the collection of 14 to 15 national associations like GROW that have come together. It's not an EU federation, it's a Europe federation. And yeah, I'm the president. I've been the president for 13 years.
long time.
Long time, yeah.
Well, the trouble is with a lot of these things is the titles get progressively more challenging to keep track of, I find. So,
yeah, well, I didn't give
thanks
you
for explaining.
It's a German federation. I didn't give you the German title because I struggle to even say that. Europäische Föderation der Bauwerk Begründen. That's really complicated.
Yeah, I'll definitely leave that one to you.
Yeah.
But we thought it'd be really interesting to have a look at some of the green roofs and what's going on in London. So we find ourselves on one here, which is quite an impressive one.
Yeah, it's
There's quite a few others around you can see as well. So I don't know if you want to explain a bit about what's going on with green roofs and the challenges they're facing and what's happening in London.
Well, yeah, I mean, when I first got involved in this, which is worth saying, I'm actually an actor and a circus performer. I got involved in this. I don't have any knowledge of the construction industry when I got involved. I was just a bird watcher and I found this rare bird and we came up with this idea about brown roofs to mitigate for this bird. This is about 1997. And I then ended up flying to Switzerland, finding out all sorts of stuff about why we could do green roofs, even though everybody was telling me we couldn't. And what's great now, we're on this roof. This was a planning condition about 2004, was installed about 2008. But if you go around the city of London, where we're in the city now, the city of London has the densest area of green roofs, certainly in the United Kingdom, but maybe even in Europe, because it's got about 7.9 square metres per citizen. Mm. And, you know, Berlin, the whole of Metro Berlin has 1 metre squared. And so over the 20 years I've been involved, you know, the City of London made their first kind of policy thing about 2002. So nearly every new building in the City of London over the last 18, 19 years has in some way been constrained to have some kind of green roof. Mm. You know, one of the exceptions, of course, is the walkie-talkie, which has got a sky garden inside. And obviously that was a planning thing that, you know, the public can go up into this closed garden. But you can look over the City of London and I kind of calculate, and it's, you know, it's not granular accurate, that being somebody who likes nature, is a bumblebee is never more than about 250 metres from a green roof in the City of London. And that's the City of London. But in 2008, Greater London Authority, I helped campaign and then wrote the technical document to support the London Green Roof Policy, which came into being in 2008. Mm. And so I wrote a report in 2019 to celebrate the policy, because we went from about, you know, 20 years ago, there's probably about 20,000 square metres in the whole of Greater London, not even that. There's now, my last calculation, because I've just mapped it again, is it's 1.9 million square metres of green roofs in London. And the only way you make green roofs happen is through policy. Yeah. And we have a London policy, and there are a few other places that have policies. But, you know, Cambridge has got one recently. But really, London's led the way because of the uniqueness of the Greater London Authority and about how, you know, London can make these sort of long-term strategic planning processes.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's amazing to see how quickly the change is starting to happen. You know, most new buildings are starting to have green roofs. But I wanted to ask you, what is the difference between a lot of these green roofs? You mentioned the Sky Garden,
yeah,
but then you get more intensive green roofs where obviously people see trees. And that, I think, is what people imagine when they think of a green roof. You think of it as this kind of a forested rooftop covered in trees and big plants, whereas actually something like this, you know, could you explain a bit more about this roof garden here that we've got?
Well, this is not a roof garden, this is a green roof. And so I'll explain this in a minute, because first of all, the Sky Gardens is not a green roof, because the Sky Gardens is inside and there's a glass roof on top of it. So a green roof is a roof that has soil and vegetation. Mm-hmm. Now there's different types. There's, generically, we have extensive or intensive. And that comes down to maintenance. So what you're talking about, trees and gardens on roofs, that's going to be high maintenance. Watering, pruning, all the usual stuff that you have in a park and garden. This is an extensive green roof, and there's different types of extensive green roofs. And extensive green roofs are basically low maintenance, and some people don't maintain them at all. But that's really the two generic. There's a halfway house. There's called a semi-intensive or semi-extensive. There's one which I'll show you later on. But when we get into the extensive, we have to be very, very particular about how we talk about extensive green roofs and what those types are. So when we get into the extensive green roof thing, there are different types. And the way I want to describe this, because I know a lot of landscape architects will be watching this, a lot of architects, is, travellers, once we're on this type of thing, which is not really accessible to people, we're in, sadly, the mentality of people is to buy a product, buy a system. So we have sedum, we have biodiverse, and they're the two main types in the Grow Code of Practice, which is going to be launched on June the 6th this year. And I'm just highlighting that so that people actually read it. Now, what happens is in the world of architecture, when you don't have a planning policy, is, give me a green roof and make it as light as possible. And that's really where the sedum idea comes from, because sedums, you can make these blankets where they're pretty thin, can sort of survive on very, very, 20 mil of rock wool or 20 mil of substrate. But the Grow Code says it should be on 60 millimetres of substrate. And you do need to actually irrigate them in droughts. And that's people just go, okay, tick the box. And I get people telling me, we've designed lots of green roofs. I said, no, sorry, you've just got a sedum roof and shoved it up there. This one is a sedum roof which has been turned into a biodiverse green roof. And that's got these substrate mounds, and it's got these wildflowers in it. And really, the way London tries to do it in the back of all the policies and the planning condition is, we want 80 to 150 mil of substrate planted and seeded with wildflowers and sedums. Now, of course, we get this.
Just while we're here, so why are you putting up, piles of logs? Why are you putting up, why are these mounds here?
I think we'll come back to that in a minute. Because I have to then go back to that bit because we're just doing types, then we get into the granular detail. Sure. I've got to do that, else I'll get confused. So then, again, we're always, this is a big issue in green roofs. I want instant effect. The architect, the designer wants instant effect.
Well, it's because it's easy and cost-effective a lot of the time as well, isn't it?
Instant effect is about, I want it to look good on the day it opens.
Yeah.
And that is really not a good way to do vegetation. So,
or landscapes in general.
Yeah. So we get these wildflower blankets now as well, and blah, blah, blah. But really the best way to do a green roof in terms of its long-term health is to plant and seed it. Now, I've got to bring up the other type because I'm partly responsible for the other type that people are still using. It's not raining, so shall we carry on?
Yeah, let's carry on,
So you'll still find a lot of people will say, councils and planning departments will say, I want a brown roof. And I'm one of the 5 people who invented the term brown roof. And I was probably the person at the time in the late 90s and early noughties who really got it into people's consciousness, and it was part of the Olympics, and it's part of this planning policy and that planning policies. And I get people come up to me and say, Mr. Gedge, you don't understand. We want a brown roof. And I go, I do understand, because actually I was the one who really promoted it. So the brown roof idea was that, this is the early days where there was no really green roofing companies, other than sedum companies. So a bunch of nature lovers like me down in Deptford Creek went, okay, we've got this bird called the black redstart, which I'll talk to you about later on. What we want to do is shove the crushed brick and concrete on the roof and let all the plants come as they do. And that was about 1998 we came up with that idea.
Some of that here as well.
And then I flew off to Switzerland, met a few people in Europe, and they just went, that's a really stupid idea. And it really is a stupid idea. Oh, there's a dunnock singing over there. Because when you put crushed concrete on a roof, it doesn't hold any water. And therefore you get really, really xeric conditions. And also, when you let self-colonisation happen, you get all the plants you don't want on a roof, buddleia, Canadian fleabane. And so we realised this about 2002, 2003, and we did all this research. So we moved to this idea of the biodiverse green roof, that you seed them, you use a good commercial green roof substrate, and you'll get a better result overall. So I just wanted to highlight the brown roof because there's people still saying to me, oh no, Mr. Gedge, we need a brown roof. And I'm going like, no, you do not need a brown roof because it's a really bad idea.
So here we are in another part of the green roof. And this is a bit different to the others because this is actually managed and more engaged with, where the other area is kind of more left alone, really, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, they were set aside for nature conservation, really, but this was set aside originally for extra air conditioning. And so the company, they started a staff food growing process. So, there's about 5 or 6 staff members who come up here and food grow in normal times. Obviously, it looks a bit tawdry at the moment because obviously nobody's been in the office for a year and a half, and so it hasn't been looked after as well. But, there's a context here talking about COVID and also talking about mega cities. Access to green space in cities is really, really important. And in dense urban cities like the City of London, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Seoul, you think of any mega city, green roofs are really good places for people to have access to green space. Maybe grow food, but maybe just be able to sit by a really wild, unmanaged green roof. It's one of my big bugbears because technically some of the planning conditions now say, oh, those green roofs, they're for biodiversity, nobody's allowed on them. And I'm going like, well, I walk on Blackheath, which is, just a big sort of dry grassland. Surely if people lived in, apartment blocks and could go on the upper roof and just sit by a wild grassland, what's wrong with that? They do that in Berlin, but generally when we think about, it's going to be accessible to people, suddenly gets into high-end landscape. You're like, well, why does it have to be high-end landscape? Why can't it just be, naturalistic, biodiverse green roofs, so people are sitting in, if they're sat in a nature reserve?
Exactly. Well, it's, a lot of people don't travel out of the city, which is something people don't realise. My mum used to work on a farm where they took lots of kids from London and they take them out and show them, sheep in the fields and asking them about, have you ever seen a tractor before? And the kids would all say, oh yeah, I have, but on TV, they've never seen one in real life. So actually you don't realise that a lot of people, this is where they spend the majority of their time. And if they're not getting access to it here, they're not getting access to it anywhere.
Well, also inversely, people drive out of the city to go to nature.
Yeah, when they could have it on their doorstep.
People, I'm from the countryside, actually from the coast down East Kent. People say to me, oh, Dusty, you're into nature. Why do you live in London? I go like, because it's actually full of really interesting nature. And, it's against this myth, I better get out to the countryside to make contact with nature. You could actually have all nature in cities if you greened up all the roofs, but don't make them all formal parks.
Yeah, definitely.
It's about diversity. I used to be on the London Food Board. People used to talk about industrial scale urban farming. I used to go like, oh my God, here we are. We're going to have rows and rows of lettuces, This community food growing as a social activity, I think it's fantastic. And if we had a diversity of roofs, parks, gardens, some wilder, some less wild, a diversity of green spaces across a city like London, it'd just be really interesting and would also make the city better from a climate change adaptation point of view and from, that's a climate crisis. And also from the biodiversity crisis. And, we can do these things.
Exactly, and a lot of people don't realise that these more managed landscapes actually have huge ecological value. Quite often people, you think of your wilderness which is left alone, but actually, that is not necessarily as good as it could be if people were engaged, and people often are kept very separate from the natural world, where actually they have a really important relationship with it and can offer huge benefits to the natural world, but we're often seen as two totally opposed forces.
Well, I've got an anecdote actually. I've never shared anything that I've spoken to live. Is when I was I think I was about 11 and I used to do some work for my stepfather, who was a structural engineer down in Margate, Thanet Way, and there was this park, and at one end of the park there was a great big mound of rubble. Now, my stepfather was a lot older, he was born in 1922, and he used to say to me, look at this lovely amenity grassland, lovely, and look at that pile of rubbish over there. And that's where all the kids were playing. And that's where all the birds were. But, culturally, amenity grassland really like that. But that big pile of rubbish where all the kids were on their mountain bikes and where the linnets were and the goldfinches were, the most interesting thing in that part was the rubbish at the end of it.
Exactly.
And it's this English garden idea. And, going to the managed landscape, there is nothing I can think of in the United Kingdom that has not been impacted on by humans historically.
Yeah.
Positively and negatively. So heathlands are there because of people. A lot of marshlands are there for people. One of my favourite nature reserves in the country is Stob Marsh, which is down in East Kent. Now, I was there actually at the weekend, and somebody said, this is a pristine wilderness. I said, no. It used to look like that, which is wet meadows, cattle meadows. I said, Stob Marsh is here because of a collapsed coal mine.
Yeah.
Stob Marsh was not like that until the Kent coal mine at Chislett collapsed. So and there's the Wigan Flashes. So we sometimes have this myth that, I could really go on about this one, because, I've been involved in nature since I was a kid, and there's something in Western, Judeo-Islamic Christian culture that harks back to some kind of Eden.
Yeah.
Like everything was, it was fine before the 1945 and maths suddenly started to farm the country in a bad place. So there's a whole preservation culture, which I'm not saying is bad, preserving some things is good. But actually, this myth that at some time everything was perfect, I don't get it. I really don't. And it's like, we've got to go back to the time before we ate the apple.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what are we going to do to future-proof the cities now, create good places for wildlife now, and not be retrospective to some past Eden, which really is a myth.
Well, and it's unachievable because we built on everything.
Yeah.
This is the thing. We often think, let's, as you say, get back to what we had before. But actually, in a way, you lose such an opportunity for innovation, especially when you come to such built-up areas like this. You need to be innovative.
Well, people say to me here, I've seen, and I won't mention any names, say, what we're going to do is we're going to make a green roof that's going to hark back to pre-Roman times in London. I'm going like, pre-Roman times in London? I mean, give me a break. Can we create a landscape that is for the 21st century, that delivers for biodiversity for the 21st century, except for some idea that maybe it was like this before 52 BC and the Romans invaded? I'm But, I'm sounding irate here, I'm sorry, but there is so much of that still in our culture. There's a political party which is green. People locally are saying to me, we want to go around and look at all the places we need to preserve in where I'm from. I'm going like, most of those are preserved already.
Yeah.
What are we going to do for the future, for wildlife, and for climate adaptation?
That's it. And how do we build that into what we're doing? And that's one of the most fundamental things, because as we were talking about earlier, it goes back to infrastructure and things like that. We need to change the way we view the natural world. And I have a very infrastructural view of these things, as I know you do as well. And actually, we need to be looking at what services do they provide, and how are they going to provide for the future, and how do we design that in, and how do we cater for that? And that's one of the biggest challenges at the moment, but also the biggest opportunity for what we're doing, I think.
Well, I mean, it's imperative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely, it is.
But we have to change a bunch of stuff there, if I may. But let's go for a walk. Yeah, and I'll talk about that. Yeah.
So how do we go about creating this infrastructure? We've said landscape needs to be an integral part of what we do, and it becomes an integral part of how we think about how we design the city. How do we deal with hydrology and all those type of things? So how do we deal with that?
Well, let's just consider what infrastructure is. That's the first thing, because it's actually interesting where we're going with green roofs and green walls, because here we are on a modern building. Yeah. And I can tell you now, like, this is all air conditioning units. This is all chillers and air conditioning units right in the middle of this green roof. So from an infrastructure point of view, this is what's important.
Yeah.
Right? That's an air conditioning unit. In the middle of a heat wave, nobody cares. Nobody worries about buying an air conditioning unit. And I've got to tell you this now, and I read it, and I've never found, it was ages ago. Since about 1920, buildings have not been designed for people. They've been designed for air conditioning units. Right? Now, you just consider that. So fundamentally, when the modern air conditioning unit came up, it's a good idea if you're in a hot country. We design buildings for air conditioning units, nothing else. Now, in terms of soil and vegetation and nature-based solutions are about air conditioning.
Yeah.
So if you put lots of green roofs up in a city like London and we have a heat wave, technically, and there's a lot of modelling for this, the city should be cooler, the rooms with space below it should be cooler, and therefore we should use less air conditioning. So, I would contend if architects started to design buildings for vegetation and soil and not air conditioning units, you'd probably have less air conditioning units. Now, this is just an interesting thing. And so you go, right, okay, so soil and vegetation in terms of a building like this is part of the air conditioning.
Yeah.
Forget what it looks like, I don't care. It's part of the infrastructure of dealing with air conditioning, which uses a lot of carbon. So the other thing is, of course, sustainable urban drainage comes up. So what do we do when we make a plot? We go, right, there's the drains. Da, da, da. When you make a roof, one of the most annoying things if you're involved in trying to design green roofs, interesting green roofs, is suddenly I get the roof plan, everybody decided where the water's going.
Yeah.
Because the green roof is not considered part of the infrastructure. Now, if you go, right, before there's any drains or anything, and we go to a drainage outlet, I mean, before you decide where all that is, we're going to decide where the green roofs are.
Yeah.
Right? So green roofs are the first start of the drainage cycle on a building. Yeah? Just like rain gardens should be and swells at the ground level.
Yeah.
So that is nothing to do with biodiversity. That's nothing to do with landscape architecture. That's infrastructure. And if we change the culture how we design buildings from that start, you'll probably have less downpipes, store more rainwater, and probably have more impact on suds. But at the present moment, never happens.
Well, exactly. Well, yeah, indeed. I mean, it's a big problem even in the landscape world. We need to look at these things more holistically, and we need to look at things and go, well, actually, how do we tie up all of these services we need to provide at the beginning? And actually, it's putting hydrology, ecology, and all of these things in first. How do we meet those targets, and then how do we design around them? Where do the buildings actually go?
But how are we going to do that?
But that's the question.
We have to turn around and say to the client, before any engineer gets anywhere near anything, we're going to try and work out where the soil and vegetation is going to go on the roofs, on the sides, to decide what infrastructure you then need inside the building. And I've got to finish this up. The greatest success, people in the sustainable urban drainage world will know this name. Tom Lipton from Portland, Oregon. He was the guy who started all that. And Tom Lipton was a landscape architect. And he always says, he's a very personal friend of mine, he says to me, Dusty, my biggest success was landscape runs sustainable urban drainage in Portland, not the engineers. And it's quite interesting, which is not to knock the drainage engineers. What happens in Portland, as Tom said to me, and I went there and was given actually a Blue Heron Award, actually, very nice. And he says, look, there's a new development come, we design all the landscape and everything, and then the engineers then modify it to ensure
that it works.
From, in terms of volumes and things. At the present moment of time, what happens probably here is the engineers go, right, there you go, now you can dress it.
That's it, exactly.
And so we do it the wrong way round, because landscape and ecology is seen as beautification and fluff. It's not seen as integral infrastructure. And there's a word called green infrastructure, nature-based solutions and ecosystem services. Still, culturally, we're viewing it as fluff.
Yeah, but the thing is as well, there's such a strong economic case for it, and for a number of reasons. And I've talked about this in previous episodes, and we've got people on to talk about it in the future. But it saves an awful lot of money for clients as well. Engineering solutions are very expensive. The softer solutions are much cheaper. If you can go and figure out where water's going to go and how it's going to work and use the landscape that's there, there's a huge opportunity to save. And also, we've been involved in it recently in some of our projects in terms of negotiating land. Because actually, when you start looking at the land, you go, actually, this land doesn't have the capacity for the houses we thought it once did. And when you start looking at it through more of a landscape lens and you realise that getting all of this stuff in will save you a lot of money, but potentially you won't get as many houses as you thought you might do, but you're going to save so much cost overall, you can negotiate for a cheaper value on the land and all that type of thing too.
I'll argue that you could probably have the same amount of houses, you just have to go taller and build denser, which of course, in the English rural communities, we don't want dense, we want nice pitched roofs. And you go like, hang on a minute, we can deliver and vegetate and make all that integral. And so there's a question there about how we are fixated in this country about pitched roofs.
No, indeed,
if you go to Switzerland, it's very, very common in villages and towns to have, 4 or 5 story housing blocks, and they be covered with green roofs.
Well, again, it's how we use the city, isn't it? If they become accessible or people can use them, it becomes everyone benefits. And there needs to be that wider discussion of how we approach that.
But outside of London or big cities, everything's pitched roofs, 2 stories.
Indeed.
That's a cultural thing we need to challenge as well.
But this goes back to your discussion earlier on mention of policy. Yeah, there's a lot happening on policy at the moment. I don't know if you want to talk about the urban greening factor and biodiversity net gain.
Oh, well, urban greening factor. Let's go and talk about the urban greening factor out here.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have a quick message from one of our sponsors. And it's that we're thrilled to announce that Marshalls is the sponsor of this episode. As the UK's leading supplier of sustainable concrete and natural stone products for the built environment, Marshalls is committed to doing the right things for the right reasons, delivered in the right way, ethically and sustainably. From fairly traded stone to low-carbon concrete bricks, Marshalls believes we can create better spaces, putting people, communities and the environment first. Find out more about the firm's green initiatives in our podcast links below. So the other thing we were talking about earlier is policy. You know, it's a massive driver behind everything we do. So how is this growing and adapting and changing to work with green roofs?
Yeah, well, the next 10 years, I think we're going to find a lot of nature-based solution processes entering policy. And in the UK, London, you know, kind of led the way in terms of green roof and green wall policies. And so the 2008 policy, which was, you know, the mayor expects green roofs and green walls in all major developments. Well, actually, that's going to change because, and it's going to change not in a detrimental way for green roofs and green walls, but we're going to have an urban greening. You know, that black red starts in there now. Look at him.
Yeah,
he's just in there. Look, I knew this would happen.
It's still there. It's just behind
still there,
the
mate.
thing. Yeah. You come here and go a bit lower. Ah, it's just flown off.
Ah, well, you know. Well, you know, I've spent hours up here. I've got a few shots of them, but I've never got a video of them, which is what I'm trying to do. But that's a bit of fun, isn't it, eh? As I always say to people, you can't take the bird out of Dusty. Anyway, where were we? Well, obviously we saw a black red start, so I had to go and take a picture of it.
Yeah.
Obviously, black red start's how I got involved in it. But yeah, so the new London plan, we won't have a distinct green roof and wall policy. It'll have the urban greening factor policy. And the urban greening factor policy, you know, it's a very good thing because it's about, you know, there's a plot of land. You know, you've got to score a certain score to meet the urban greening factor. Mm-hmm. And you can change the score depending on where you are in an urban realm. So if you're in a peri-urban realm, you know, the score might be a bit lower because, you know, basically you don't need so much green infrastructure on a peri-urban. But in a dense urban area, the score will be a height to deliver, you know, good green infrastructure on a plot. And that means you're going to do green roofs. So it won't be a distinct green roof policy, but basically you're going to have to do green roofs.
Yeah, no choice, exactly, yeah.
What a lot of people misunderstand about the urban greening factor, it's just a landscape tool to ensure that you've got enough you know, landscape in it. So trees score a certain level, green roof will score a certain level. And, you know, within the urban greening factor at the GLA level, but certainly in the City of London, because the City of London, we help write the urban greening factor for the City of London, you know, we ensure that a good biodiverse green roof actually has a better score than just a simple cedar blanket, you know. So what is exciting is I've noticed that DEFRA are talking about maybe having a national urban greening factor. And I know Manchester, the combined authority, are looking at an urban greening factor. And I think it's a really smart tool. And I think it could be transformational. And, you know, on this policy thing, people have said to me, oh, well, we need government to make a national, you know, everybody should, you know, demand green roofs. And I've never been convinced about that, you know, because, you know, I love my green roofs, but, you know, sometimes maybe the green roof is not the right thing, you know, another thing is the right thing. And so I think tools like urban greening factor and cities deciding that score, you know, not something from central, you know, cities decide that like they do in Germany. Cities decide, or in America, they decide exactly what they want. You know, what does the city want? Because of its particular circumstances. And I think that's much more alive, that is. So,
and how's that going to affect other things? So so obviously things are ranked differently, different types of green roof are ranked. Does that affect things like living walls and things as well? Are we going to see more of those? Is it going to help transform that side of things? Because obviously sometimes where we are now, for example, there's a huge amount of infrastructure on this roof, which obviously limits the amount of green roof there'll be. So some buildings obviously have more or less of that. So will that lead to changes in other areas? Will we see more living walls along the edges or terraces on lower edges and balconies and things like that, which are greened?
Oh yeah, I think so, because whether it sees more green walls. I'm not too sure, but I wouldn't want to say yay or nay on that. But certainly you'll see a lot more balconies and upper roofs and probably more street trees than you normally would, because you've got to get the score.
Yeah.
You know? And personally, I would set the score a little bit higher than the city's done, to make it a little bit more, a bit harder to achieve. But what is interesting is when the urban greening factor has been sort of tried out and it's going into policies in other London boroughs, is, everybody emails me and my colleague Gary and go like, oh, can you do as a training course on the urban greening factor? And you go, it's pretty simple actually, you just add it all up.
Yeah.
Have you got enough? And it's quite interesting because you think, oh, it's new, it must be complicated. And it was originally started in Berlin, and then it went to Seattle. It went to Malmo, and then it went to Seattle. And it's now in Washington, DC. And they've got different green area factor or green area ratio, and we've called it the urban greening factor. It's just a really, really pretty simple, but really effective way to ensure that there is a lot of landscape on developments. And also, what's interesting in the City of London, because, I like this where you can vary. It's not locked. So if you're in a conservation area of the City of London where you've got a lot of old housing and a lot of, ancient buildings, the score might be a bit lower.
Yeah.
So you
can adapt it to suit.
The city can adapt it, or the local authority can adapt it to the places. Or you can have one big new development going up. Let's, I don't know, like the one going up at Meadowbank in Edinburgh. Now, Edinburgh could choose to have a very, very high score for that one because, it's, open space that is going to be turned into, well, it's not actually open space, but, you could have open space which is going to be turned into high density living. You say, right, okay, it's open space. It's going to have 0.6, not 0.3, so cities can be quite judicious about how they use it, and I think that's far more intelligent rather than this kind of blanket thing from national government, because blanket things from national governments tend to end up being what they are. But on the back of this, the other sort of policy thing which will come into being in England is Biodiversity Net Gain. And so people are going to me, oh, Biodiversity Net Gain, you must really love that, Dusty. Well, not a fan, to be honest.
And why is that? It's quite limiting, because it's only, well, as the name suggests, is it primarily looking at biodiversity opposed to the wider environmental objectives and targets we should be aiming for? Because biodiversity is only one facet of what we could achieve in terms of green infrastructure and things, isn't it?
Conceptually, Biodiversity Net Gain is a really good idea.
Yeah.
And basically, like the EU has we have a net gain aspiration. Berkeley Homes, one of our principal South East England developers, they have an aspiration for net gain. The thing is with Biodiversity Net Gain, one of the problems, in my experience, I spent most of my time doing nature conservation the last 20, 25 years in a serious urban context. So most of the processes that come out of Natural England and DEFRA were designed for non-urban areas. Yeah. And so Biodiversity Net Gain metric, it's great for a housing estate in the middle of the home counties, but in London, it just doesn't work. Well, and I have to be straight here because I've looked at the net gain metric for green roofs, and I'm not speaking out of turn here. Quite a few of the London borough ecologists have said to me, well, it's take us back 20 years. Because we managed to do all this biodiverse green roofing. I mean, it's quite bland about it. And to be quite frank, and I'm noticing this, and I know I really shouldn't say it like this because I am a green roof expert, but half of this stuff that's been written about green roofs at a policy level is written by people who don't know anything about green roofs. Yeah. And I'm really sorry, they really do not know anything about green roofs. And the trade body, we've got our codes of practice, we've got people like myself, I spent 20 years involved in this. I have an agenda to make sure that green roofs go up, which are good for the city, for what the city wants. But you get a lot of academics coming and say, oh, well, green roofs, and they're reinventing the wheel, and,
we kind of don't need to.
Well,
we've done it enough, now we've figured it out.
Well, you spend 20 years, looking at all sorts of different green roof processes and systems, and, and you go, I could have answered that question in a day. Yeah. But it's just how we do everything. Oh, well, they're very clever people, so they must know about it. I see EU projects. Okay, we're gonna do EU projects which includes green roofs, and we're gonna spend 3 years discovering what green roofs are. Well, that's a lot of money wasted, isn't it? There's people in the country who could tell you tomorrow. But it's just how everything works, I'm sorry,
Well, it's a really valid point, because there are huge risks associated with things like biodiversity net gain. For example, we were looking at a project recently which didn't meet biodiversity net gain, and you start looking at it, and the only real solution is to make more space. So actually, the only option is to take a few houses out, make a bit more space, and allow it to go back to nature, or manage it more sustainably. But actually, they're still missing a huge trick. They're missing all of that stuff about SUDs and all these other options we have. So there is this real risk of that. And as you said, in an urban environment, it's not always so effective, because I've worked on various schemes where it's, an old industrial estate or whatever that's being regenerated, and actually there's nothing there. So anything you do, in a sense, is net gain. But actually, and that is almost a pass potentially out of achieving, what they could achieve if they looked at it more holistically and at this higher level.
Yeah, I'm gonna, I'll end up going down a rabbit hole here. But we've got lots of new tick box exercises. We've got building with nature and this benchmark and that benchmark. And at the end of the day, we have to be careful that. We've got such legislation, we've got biodiversity legislation, and really, we need to be going, how do we do all these things and actually do environmental net gain? And, you've given me the industrial site, context. You go to an industrial site that's been there for 20 years and you go on and do net gain. You go like, yeah, but, how do you measure that net gain?
Exactly,
what we want to do is say whatever goes in there is not better than was there, but is fit for purpose for the 21st century. And that's some of the problems with net gain. And I think it's also, implicitly one of the problems of doing things about the built environment from a rural perspective.
Yeah.
Now, in your context where, we'll have to lose a few houses to get biodiversity net gain, just build 4-story building, put a green roof on it, you got your net gain. Oh, no, hang on, it's the countryside, we're not allowed 4-story buildings. Yeah. You go like, right, okay,
Well, perhaps we should,
And dare I say it, controversial, the green belt. Well, okay, it's an industrial farm, which is just putting pesticides everywhere. What's so valuable about the green belt? A lot of people won't like that. But you kind of go, well, is it the countryside? Or is it an industrial factory?
Well, this goes to the other argument, isn't it? Public money for public good. We've got to, we really have to rethink a lot of our processes and how we adapt them, as you say, to the 21st century and beyond. We've got to rethink how we use the landscape and the environment to benefit us and, people, place and nature.
Yeah.
How do they all work together, and how do we, get that ecosystem going, which includes everything. Ecosystems aren't just ecology; it's how everything works together.
Yeah. Well, I think we're tapering over back to some places before, it goes back to this idea that there's this pristine wilderness before we had coal and oil, and that we've gone around messing things up, and we have messed things up, but we're actually part of the ecosystem. And there's too much of we're separate. So as an anecdote, which got nothing to do with cities, it's one there's two I keep in my mind about this. There's actually three, actually. So when John Muir went, okay, we'll make this first national park, which is the Yosemite, the view was we're going to protect this pristine wilderness, Well, I can't remember exactly. It was some kind of railway magnate came on shortly afterwards and who wanted to get everybody to go on holiday there. He said, we've got one problem, in this pristine wilderness. There's some human beings live in it who are called the Shoshonen, And the Shoshonen were kicked out of the Yosemite, So, things go on, and then the wolves are reintroduced. Oh, we're putting it back to balance, And there's a lot of ecologists at the Yosemite who turn and say, well, there's one bit of the ecology missing. The Shoshonen. Yeah. And I use that because, we get a lot of people say, oh, it's human beings, they mess everything up. Well, one part of human beings does mess things up. Mm-hmm. But actually, in the UK landscape, Dorset moorland, Dorset heathland, it's there because people grazed it. Nearly every bit of the United Kingdom, its ecology is to do with the human beings of being part of that ecology. So I walk on Blackheath, where all the little dry paths are. that's where all the solitary bees are. I get kind of say, oh, it's compacted earth, it's not good. And I'm going like, well, my solitary bees really like it. And so what we do is we have this perception of some kind of pristine wilderness way back when. What we should do is, and I think the living landscapes thing that the Wildlife Trust is doing is really great, because they're almost saying, there's still some retrospectiveness. They're like, we've got to create a living landscape for the 21st century, which is good for biodiversity, good for people. And when we're designing places where people live, they need to live in nature. And I just want to bring up Berkeley Homes again. I can't think of any other, but Berkeley Homes virtually in London sells its houses by saying, come live in nature. Now, they're not doing that for moral reasons, because they're a housing developer. And I don't mean that in a nasty way. They're going, nature sells.
Yeah.
And so we've got to move away from this thing of, 2 up, 2 down, pitched roofs, blah, 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 and go like, right, what is the right way to build and to deliver infrastructure through landscape and biodiversity for the 21st century? But we're still, some of us going, oh, no, we have to live in the past,
Yeah, live in the future.
Yeah, I'll just bring up a Birmingham context when I did the early work, because I did a lot of work in the early time in East Side, actually. And, I had a lot of nature people in Birmingham saying, oh, you're just encouraging development. I was going like, well, I'm not going to encourage development. I think development's going to happen. So what I'm going to do is try and make those developments better for nature. Yeah. Now, I wouldn't want to tread on anybody's sensibilities from anywhere that I don't live, but same in South East London. People say, oh, you're just helping developers. I said, well, they're going to build the buildings anyway. Yeah. So if we're going to build the buildings anyway, why don't we make them better for nature? And actually, as we moved on, make them better for people. Yeah. And there's some brilliant developments in London, which Berkeley Homes is. I always highlight those. I haven't got a share, but they're brilliant developments because beautiful wildflower meadows, getting suds in there now, and there's green roofs, and there's this wonderful playground in Kidbrooke Village, which has got all these little rain gardens running through it, and the kids can run in the rain gardens, and people commute from 2 kilometres away to go and play in that playground. Because it's a nice place to be. That's it, exactly. Now, they aren't buying houses in that because of that playground. I'm dumb. Now, when did somebody ever go, oh, a really good playground with suds in it is going to sell flats? That's the future. Yeah, well, this is where we've got Adam and Andre from Davies White coming on later, who do a lot of nature play. And, they're doing huge amounts of work in this area. And they've got case studies now where they've gone into old play areas, redesigned them, put loads of trees back in. They've got some great before and after images. And the value of all the properties has shot up. And people are happy to live there. Normally, they go down if there's a playground. And it's all about that, designing and getting as much from it as possible. And it's just that perception. But then, a lot of the time we do things pretty poorly. So it gives a bad perception of these places, doesn't it? Yeah. But I just wanted to ask you about more of the international context, because obviously there's a lot of countries and places, Singapore springs to mind that we spoke about before the podcast, and they're doing a huge amount with the, city in a garden concept. And there's a huge amount of green roofs and things going on there. And that's now a fundamental part of the whole city's approach to the environment and the future. And they've done exactly what you said. They've got green bridges connecting some of these new towers. I was saying before, it's easy to sit there and think, actually, is this a tokenistic sort of gesture? Is it a bit of greenwashing going on or whatever? But then we were sat on one building which had a huge swimming pool, the Marina Bay Sands, a huge swimming pool, massive, tourist attraction. And we were sat there going, is this actually, how good is this? And at that very moment, a lizard fell out of the tree onto my friend, and you think, actually, if they're getting up here, clearly there's some good. And it's, of course, better to have these things than not. But it's interesting how different places are approaching it. How have you found it? Well, we got, my little world in terms of green roofs really comes from Germany, Switzerland and Austria. And there's thousands of square metres there, and across North America they're doing it. The thing about we have to be careful of, there's some superb green roofs in America, Salt Lake City, the Mormon church. I've got to go there one day. You just go up the side of a Cascades Mountain onto a meadow on the top. It's all designed to sit in Utah. It's Utah landscapes. you know, there's so much opportunity, and internationally, you know, we're in a temperate climate. It's different from Singapore. You know, generally we do a lot of extensive green roofs, which are dry grasslands. Those dry grasslands can be much, much better, like they are in Switzerland, which is, I brought that idea here. They didn't really do it in Germany and Austria like they do in Switzerland. And I think we can make some really, and we are making some really, really good things happening in London because of that. And I've learned a lot from continental Europe. And that black red start just flew off again. It's just gone around the corner. We might have to break it in a minute. But, you know, I'm always really careful of the subtropics and the tropics, because it's a lot easier to do those intensive type green roofs. And I'm also cautious of the famous hotel in Singapore, because, you know, that's really funky, but it's just a swimming pool. You know, I mean, I'm sorry, that's great. But what, you know, we need whole scale greening, and we need diversity of solutions. And, you know, to a certain extent, a swimming pool on the roof with a few trees around it, that's a bit of bling, you know?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But, you know, in terms of greenwashing, you know, we're on a major legal firm's building here. And, you know, I do some work for PwC, and I've got green roofs on all sorts of commercial buildings here. And some people have said to me, oh, it's just greenwashing. No, you know, it's interesting, they have to do it for planning condition. But actually, you know, the Berkeley homes are doing it because they can sell properties, so it's not greenwashing. You know, it's part of their process. So, you know, we have to be careful of this greenwashing thing. The green roofs that are going up in Greater London, for the most part, are required. But some of the very, very big, you know, corporates, the Canary Wharfs and the PwCs, they are genuinely doing these things, and a lot of them are being monitored for biodiversity to go into their environmental reporting, which affects their FTSE listing. You know, that, you know, when you look at it at that level. So, you know, some of these big corporations are buying into this, and to me, we need policy, but I want to see every property developer to go like Berkeley Homes. We have a net gain aspiration regardless of planning policy, and we have a net gain aspiration environmentally, because that's where the market's going.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's a bit of policy and it's a bit of market forces.
That's it. And there's a lot of companies starting to do it. You know, IKEA is another great example. They're doing huge amounts for the environment. You know, huge green roofs as well.
IKEA in Greenwich, which I know well and I go on it a lot, you know, it's you know, it was built on the Sainsbury's, and the Sainsbury's was built in 1999, 2 years after I got involved in this. And the Sainsbury's was the most sustainable retail store in 1999. Had a bit of turf around the edge. Oh, Dusty, look, that green roof. And I was going, it's just a bunch of turf. IKEA, when it opened in 2019, was the most sustainable retail store in the world. And I always say to people in my talks, what's the most sustainable retail store going to be in 2039? And that's where I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Because it's got all these green roofs on, which we were talking about in 2019. Was it? No, so it was 2000. It was 1999 the Sainsbury's was built, and it was the most sustainable retail store. 20 years later, IKEA was built in 2019, and it was the most sustainable retail store. But a lot of the green roofs and the type of things we were talking about in, you know, 1999, and we were trying to get happen. Oh, we couldn't do them then. Well, they're on the IKEA roof. And IKEA, to be fair to them, have got some pretty strong commitments to this. And their new store in Vienna, completely different to IKEA in Greenwich, lots of climbing plants, and you can walk around it, you know, really interesting. And we need more like IKEA to drive this. But I think that's where climate change is breaking people up, because it's not just, you know, everybody knows they have to do something. And if they don't believe they have to do something, they're on the wrong planet.
Yeah.
But we're going to get into all sorts of Trumpian issues there, which we don't need to do.
So we just mentioned Singapore and what's going on there. And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in Europe and places, but what else is going on in Asia? Because it's quite an interesting, well, very diverse continent, a lot of very interesting stuff going on, and a lot of cities there are having to really adapt to climate change, especially, you know, in this, you know, Singapore, Malaysia. What's happening there?
Well, I know there's a lot going on in China, and China's China, so it's kind of a difficult place to talk about, because, you know, I know they've made a lot of green roofs in Chongqing and Shanghai, and, you know, there's the sponge city thing going on in China. But I think some of
Well,
the
they have
places,
forest cities as well now, don't they? That there's
forest cities,
concepts coming on.
Yeah. But I think I'm quite interested in sort of what's going on in in what I would call sort of slightly not developed countries. Latin America is a massive continent, and it's got some really, really big cities. And there's two places I want to highlight there. I mean, actually, Recife's got a policy which is in Brazil. It's the first to have a green roof policy. But I'm going to go to a place called Cordoba down in Argentina, because they actually, I interviewed the guys when I was in Bogota, which I'll come to in a moment. Cordoba's quite dry. And it's really interesting because of the brown roof history that I've got. When I interviewed them, said well, we're in a really dry place, and we're going to have dry brown roofs, because that's the nature of their place, and they're quite committed to having native vegetation in Cordoba in Argentina, which is sort of like, to the east of Argentina. But I met them in Bogota, and Bogota's really interesting because, a lot of things going on in Bogota with green walls and green roofs, but they've also got the Bogota green roof kind of code of practice, which is the most fascinating bit of work that I've come across. So most codes of practice, we have our GROW code, we have the FLL, which is German. Most are based on the FLL, and the way they work is, they go, right, okay, it's kind of like a construction manual. It's like, right, waterproofing, this. What Bogota has done, and I really love this, and I think it should be used. If the European Commission, Europe wanted to make a code of practice for green roofs in Europe, they should do it the Bogota way. Because what Bogota does, it says, right, okay, we're going to start in the macro. What does the city want? What does it want? What's its environmental performance that it wants? And then it goes down here, down here, down here. And then right at the base of the code of practice is all the technical stuff. But in all the other code of practice, all the technical stuff. And then it goes, oh, well, you get these benefits. And you go, no, we need to turn it over. What does the city want? How does it get there? And it's a beautiful thing. And you can just Google Bogota Green Roof Guideline. There's a wonderful English paper about it. And it's a really fascinating read if you're one of those kind of sad policy codes of practice guys like me, because I like this stuff. It's done by a guy called Adrian Ibanez and his team from University of Bogota. And I can't sing its praises enough. And you could use that as a code of practice for green infrastructure.
Yeah.
What we do is, right, we got all these pipes and all this. Can we get rid of the pipes and put these rain gardens in? You go like, no, what does the city want? The city wants landscape. The city wants landscape and not pipes.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of, I mean, that's a bit of a cold way to say it, but it's kind of like that. The city wants vegetation and soil. It wants vegetation and soil for sustainable urban drainage. It wants vegetation and soil for cooling. It wants vegetation and soil for biodiversity. It wants them on roofs. Right? How do we then do that? What we do, because we come from a Western kind of like, right, okay, we got a roof. How do we build a roof?
Yeah.
And then when we do that, we're all risk averse. And it's all about risk averseness. And that Bogota just goes, what does Bogota want? You go like, that's what it wants.
So yeah, the principles.
And, it's kind of really cool.
That's really important, isn't it? Because you never set your sights, and as we said earlier, it's a lot about ambition. What are they striving to do, and why do we want things to be however they're going to be? And there's quite often things are being left too late and not happening.
Yeah.
So,
and it's sort of a segue, really, always tangent. There's a lot of stuff going on about blue roofs and storing water on roofs, and again, it's a common theme for me. I've designed a few wetland roofs, and the idea is, we were talking about it earlier, that by the time I get to roof, somebody's already decided where all the downpipes are going.
Yeah.
And I met this Dutch landscape architect, so we want a cascade of roofs, where water cascades down the roofs. And so when I built these wetland roofs, the idea is you deliberately keep the water on the roof. And so this roof, the water, the downpipe is, I think the downpipe's over here, right in the middle. Let's go and look at it, yeah. I'm pretty sure there's a downpipe somewhere around here. Yeah, look, there's a downpipe, yeah. I don't want the downpipe there.
Yeah.
I want the downpipe over there, so the water runs onto the next roof. And then it runs onto the next roof. and then the next roof, however many roofs there are. And each time you could have an ephemeral wetland up here, you could have a minor pond on the next level, you could have a big pond on the next level. Maybe you don't need any drainage pipes.
Yeah.
Well, of course you will. But because we go like, oh, no, 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 and we can use all these plastic crates and all that, you go, no, let's create habitat. And
Just
landscape features.
Yeah, do more with it. Yeah.
Let's do more with it. But it was like, no, that's dressing. No, it's infrastructure. Again, we go back to the infrastructure thing.
That's it, exactly.
But we'll have a little look now at some of the, what I call, because a lot of what we talk about is the macro, but the basis of the London, the approach we sort of absorbed from Switzerland and we brought to London, it gets into some micro stuff. And it's the micro stuff which is actually interesting on several levels, but specifically into biodiversity. And we'll just go over this side because it's been a particularly cold spring, so everything's a bit late. So not all the wildflowers are out. So essentially, we've got this. This was installed as a seed and blanket, but the company in question wanted biodiversity delivery, and they called me in and they asked me how we can make it. So you might see that just here, on top of this seed and blanket, we just got a mound. And this mound is about 150 to 200 mil deep. So the background supplementary guidance really for green roofs in London is 50 to 150 millimetres. Now, if you've got 150 millimetres, you're going to get lots of wildflowers growing on top of it. So we've got some campions at the moment, and there's others coming out. You've got all these Viper's bugloss, which will come out soon, and some trefoil in there. So we've now increased the diversity away from just a sedum, whatever the sedums were. And the other thing is you put these dried logs up.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I like to nest in them. But when I put these up originally, you can see here the way it's kind of making a kind of crescent. Because the prevailing winds in London are southwesterly. And so wind is the biggest dryer on a roof. So if you, and this becomes important in a minute because I talk to you, wind is really important. So when we do that, what I did is I planted a lot of plants behind here, and obviously things have changed over 12 years, that are all water sensitive. And they all thrived for about 6 or 7 years until we had the really bad drought of 2018, which really knocked them all out. So a log is a windbreak if you put it in the right place. And so these features and this topography starts to create all these micro habitats. So, we get down here. This roof suffered pretty bad in the 2018 drought. And also it gets a lot of traffic in June for about 10 years, a lot of human traffic because it's open. So you see this mound here, you got some plantains, you got some Viper's bugloss. Normally the Viper's bugloss would be right up here by now, but the two weeks of that. We've got some cornflowers.
We've had a lot of cold weather, haven't we? Which has
it was
made
been
everything
exceptionally
quite slow.
cold.
Yeah.
And obviously, when we have a big drought, chives can grow. Chives are they're tough as hell. They can suffer most droughts. But when you have a drought and a lot of other things die back, then the chives really seed and they take over. So you've got this beautiful chive field at the moment.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of herbs. We've seen a lot of this. A lot of herbs have come through. You see over there some more campion. And we've got the honeybees. I'm not a great fan of honeybees on roofs, but we've got some oxeye daisies coming out here.
So why are you not such a fan of honeybees on roofs? Because it's a very common, a lot of companies are doing it. Is that kind of more of a greenwashy type thing? Or
I don't
is
think
it
it's
just...
greenwashing, it's not biodiversity. Honeybees are farming.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, oh, honeybees, we're doing something for biodiversity. It's farming. And the lady who does the honeybees here, she's a beekeeper and I know her very well. And But what happens is there is a bit of green. Oh, we'll put a beehive on a roof and, it doesn't have to be a green roof. And aren't we great? And you go like, well...
You could have done so much more.
I mean, you've just done some farming. It's nothing to do with the environment, honeybees. But in these logs there'll be solitary bees, which are more interesting. And I don't want the London beekeepers are saying there's far too many hives in London already. We're nearly at peak thing. So that is a bit of a tick box exercise. In this case, I'm not going to criticise Claire. She's a beekeeper. That's what she does. But I've seen a lot of couples go, oh, we'll just get a beehive up there and we'll look good. And I'm going, nah, it's not really thought through. But and also you don't need beehives on roofs because you can put beehives anywhere.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I don't really want them on a green roof because they're competing with the solitary bees and the bumblebees.
While we're on ecology side of things, we ran off earlier to try and get a picture of it. And you've got your camera here right now. You know, there's redstart on this roof, isn't there?
Yeah, there is.
And that's been a huge objective of green roofs. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, why I got involved is because there was this bird, black redstarts, nesting on all these brownfield sites in Deptford, and they were going to build on it. So, you know, to cut the story short, we just went, well, why don't you put the habitat on the roof? You know, which is the brown roof idea. And, you know, the black redstart in the city of London, you know, it was really famous after the Second World War on all the bomb sites, and then it moved out to the power stations. So, you know, there's been a pair that's forages on this roof. This is forage habitat, it's not nesting habitat. For, you know, not the same pair, ever since this roof was installed. And, you know, I see it, and sometimes it sings on St Paul's. And there's quite a few. There's another pair over at London Wall, and another one up at Bishopsgate. So there's about, I think there's probably about 5 or 6 pairs still in the city of London, and they use the green roofs, which is what I started out to try and achieve. You know, it's just kind of great, you know. But you know, the black redstart is a pretty Catholic bird. It's pretty resilient. It's at the northwest of its range in the United Kingdom. It's never going to be as prolific as it is on the continent. There's a very specific ecological reason for that, which we don't need to go into, to be honest, because we then start talking about robins and competition. But, you know, the black redstart became a driver at that time because we was building on all these brownfield sites, and they were being recognised for really rare invertebrates, you know, lots of bugs and stuff. And the green roofs fit that equation really well, because the guy in Switzerland I met, that's what he was looking at. How could we replace habitat lost at ground level for rare invertebrates? And so we did I got somebody to do a PhD study like they did in Switzerland, and we showed that putting these things up, designed appropriately, you could mitigate for the loss of habitat at ground level. The one thing we miss is wet areas, so then we started to look at how we could do wetlands, again stimulated from Switzerland because they did a lot of ephemeral wetlands. So, you know, you can start to do that. And I know I was talking to you before, you know, taking it to another level, there's quite a famous roof actually, there's 2 famous roofs. The most famous is in Switzerland is called the Wollishof water treatment plant. Now, the Wollishof water treatment plant was built in about 1913, and they literally dumped local farmland soil on the roof of these water treatment plants. And each of them, there's 5 of them, is the size of a football pitch. Now, they're pretty big roofs, yeah? They're covered now in, I think it's 16 species of orchids. You've got man orchid, you've got helleborines, you've got early marsh orchid, you've got spider orchid, bee orchid. You know, it's fantastic. I'll just go there, it's heaven. It's just farmland soil on a roof. Well, they've got about 100 mil of gravel. But then you go to St Gallen, which is a city out in the west of Switzerland, and there's this hospital. They put extensive green roofs up there. Technically, the waterproofing drainage system didn't work correctly. It didn't drain as quickly as it should have done. So a dry grassland has turned into a wet grassland, and it's covered in purple orchids. It's amazing. The Wollishof one technically has a sort of special thing. It's not quite a national park, but it's got legislation, or it's got protection that if they have to do anything to the water treatment plant, they have to keep the soil and put it back. It's a legal requirement. Because the reason being, in that part of Zurich, you won't find a meadow like that anymore because of industrial farming. So the point there is, you know, if we have the vision, we don't have to go back and say, oh, we want to go back to farmland back in the 18th century in Zurich, you know, and make everything like it was. You know, we can say, right, okay, to future-proof Zurich or London, we can create wet meadows that can have orchids on, which are actually extremely rare in the United Kingdom, wherever. And just while we're on orchids, there's a roof over on the Thames, Namura, which has about 7 or 8 purple-winged orchids, green-winged orchids that turned up. And also the Islington Recycling Centre a few years ago discovered one. And if you go down the escalator into Rotherhithe Tube Station, you can see a green roof and there's purple green-winged orchids on there. And they just turned up. So if I could make some damper areas on here, maybe green-winged orchid would turn up.
Yeah.
So the point there is, for me, is the trouble is a lot of the time people are just going, right, okay, got to do a green room, get the lights thing, shove it up there. So no, get all the right circumstances in and nature will come. And if we can have orchids on this roof in 10 years' time, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
And so we're too formulaic, tick the box, So you can't really tell here, but there's an ecological landscape here. There's lots of different mounds. And this was retrofitted onto an existing cedar roof. So you went onto a proper biodiversity roof, you'd see these big mounds, big gullies. You know, there's lots of pattern on it because you're creating a mosaic of habitat. You do that, you're doing something good for nature, and also you've provided an opportunity for other nature that you don't know to arrive.
Exactly.
That's how we should be doing it.
Yeah, definitely.
Got a helicopter.
Yeah.
So you can see just over there, there's two small green roofs at either end of that paving. You know, that was a planning condition. That's a little bit of a tick box. You know, they're just simple basic cedar roofs. But right down there, you can see some trees and bushes. That's one poultry. It's a restaurant. So, you know, you've got some trees and bushes and shrubs. And then right over there, below the spa, you can just see the trees on Cannon Street Station, which is a complete park. Yeah. So right opposite here, there's this sort of semi-intensive shrubs and bushes. That was originally a cedar roof, but obviously this company's gone, well, actually, we want to improve things for biodiversity because it's not accessible. And they've gone more of a semi-intensive route. And so on this is new change, you can't really see this tree there, but there's actually a big meadow roof on there. And then right over there, there's 2 or 3 green roofs in the distance. Now, the point why I'm saying that is, like, already just within 600-700 meters of this roof, there's all these series of other green roofs. So there is a network of habitat. And one of the problems we have sometimes when we think about ecology, we talk about networks, and they're kind of like physical networks where they all have to connect at ground level because you see everything in plan. Well, you know, if you're in a mountain range, yeah, not everything's sort of linear connected. And so when I first got involved, I went to Switzerland, and you know, it's my first trip there. I was talking green roofs, and I went to the R Gorge, which is a really deep gorge, right? It's near Maringen, and you know, I was remember there, and there's this street, and it's only in places it's quite narrow. It's about that narrow. I was watching this blackbird, and it was feeding down on the, you know, the river bed, and then it flew all the way to the top of the gorge, which is probably as tall as Barclays Tower. And you go, well, okay, this bird in this mountain range doesn't have this problem. So when I look at the city, there's a little green roof down there. From a bird's point of view, it doesn't care about all this. It just, you know, it's just doing what it's doing. But we get this thing, this human perspective, oh no, this is a city. Well, basically a city, if it was all greened up at different levels, is just one great big mountain range from an ecological perspective. But because we're locked that it's a city, we can't really perceive that. So to finish up with my little joke, which anybody who knows me will know, you know, so I put one on top of Barclays Tower, 2005. And within, you know, 6 weeks of this green roof going up, there was 6 species of bumblebees, grasshoppers, whatever. And people said to me, how do the bumblebees get up there, Dusty? I said, well, they get the lift, don't they? And people go like, oh, yeah, you're joking. But, you know, they did for a moment believe me. And I use that because people then become so sort of locked in their sort of perspective as a human being. So, you know, Barclays Tower is, if I remember rightly now, it's 132 metres high. You know, nobody would question a bumblebee flying from here 132 metres along a linear path to another bit of wildflower. When it's on the roof, they go, oh. And you kind of go, that's because it's a struggle for us to think how we would get up there. But a bee flying up there, well, you know, I've seen black redstarts up there, all sorts of birds up there. It's 132 metres up in the sky. So we kind of sometimes can limit what we will perceive as possible. And, you know, just all over the city of London, even you go into Southwark and you go over into the city of Westminster, there's green roofs everywhere. Now, obviously, we could do it a lot more because there's the potential to retrofit. I mean, we could retrofit 32% of central London. I mean, that would be the equivalent of a massive national park. Forget National Park City, that's just green roofs, yeah? think of the biodiversity we could have there. Think of the fact that people could come and sit on a roof like this and look over all these other roofs and be part of wildlife. And also we could have gardens and food growing and that diversity of process.
Exactly.
It's got to be a good thing for a city, and it's got to be a good thing for the biodiversity crisis and that climate change adaptation.
Definitely. I mean, well, when you have such a mosaic of habitats and uses, and just look at the incredible views. People love being in these spaces too, don't they? As we said before, it's such an important way for people to engage with the natural world.
Well, just if I may, sorry, there's a new one just being installed on a building there. And that looks like it's probably a mix of sedum. Wherever you see a crane, there'll be a green roof. Yeah. And I've just got to do this because a lady put out a tweet yesterday, and a guy I know tagged me into it, and she was up on the Shard, she was going down and said, oh, look at the city, it's all grey roofs. And I said to her, actually, just a lot of green roofs. She said, well, I couldn't see any. Well, probably up from the Shard, it's probably really difficult to see the green roofs. So I've had to send her a picture of a map, a Google map, and just say, look, count the number of green roofs. Now, maybe I'm patting the city of London on the back too much. No, 20 years ago, there were none. So we've got to kind of go,
That's it. It's interesting how this is informing the design of buildings. We were talking previously about the Bosco Verticale in Milan and how they've, they designed the whole buildings. These two incredible towers. Is it two or more than two?
It's
two?
Three.
Three?
Yes, three.
Three towers, all completely covered in trees and plants.
Yeah.
And it's all been designed off the mountain range nearby, so the species change as you move up. And that's gotten, you've been there, so it's better you explain than I.
Well, I went there in spring a few years ago. The blackcaps singing all the way up and down it. I was going like, right, okay. We go like wood blackcaps. This is vertical blackcaps. You're like, just on the mountain slope. And so Laura Gatti, who's a mate of mine, she was the arboriculturalist. She said, And then actually a few years later, they realised that they got it slightly wrong, so they've moved the trees around. They've learnt a lot, and they're constantly monitoring it. And people go like, all right, it's a very high-end, expensive place to live. You go like, but look how groundbreaking it was. Stefan Barreri was an academic architect, had an idea, put it into thing, and he's probably the busiest architect in the world at the moment. Good luck to him. But but there's sensibilities there. At the top, there's different tree species to the bottom. And it's really well thought out. And I walked around with Laura, and she was saying, like, people always say to us, we can see the birds nesting. People sitting having their breakfast watching the birds nest. These people aren't interested in birds. And you go like, suddenly nature's right, right in there. And you kind of go, that's where we've got to go.
Exactly.
A bunch of roses and lawns and, bloody bamboo and, the stuff that, they copy and paste the landscape architects. Oh, that's a roof garden. You go like, no, let's think about it. And having said that, there's a big developer, Fargo Wells, has got a beautiful green roof. It's not my kind of thing. The developer of that has got some landscape architects, and they're doing something over at Waterloo side. And I went up to advise them about some stuff, and again, strips of wildflowers, really thought through, different bushes, different shrubs, really, a diverse landscape, very little hard standing, lots of kind of going from extensive to semi-intensive, intensive, extensive, mixing it all up so you get this kind of diverse, basically roof garden, which is really good for biodiversity and probably is better for people. Just to go and sit in a, lawn with privet edge on a green roof, which is quite a few of those in London.
Well, it shows how
really boring.
It shows how these motivate people, though, doesn't it? Because Bosco Verticale, I'm pretty sure that the amount of trees and plant cover has increased since people started inhabiting it, because they've planted some of the surrounding areas too more, and people have planted things. I thought. No.
It's very interesting, Bosco Verticale, because it's quite interesting, and I've got to get this correct. The residents don't own the balconies.
Do they not?
No, because what they decided, and this is very, very smart, is to be able to maintain the Bosco Verticale in terms of how it needs to perform for the whole building. It was decided that would be in the ownership of the developer and would be maintained by the developer. The normal method is each one of those balconies would be maintained in a different way. But they said, no, this thing has to be maintained by one body, else it will lose what it's meant to do. So people may have planted some things, but that would have had to be passed through the people who own the balcony, which is not the people who live in the flats. And it's actually a really good concept.
It is a good concept.
It's a fantastic concept. And they have, I haven't been for 3 years now. I think it was 2017 I went. They did change some of the facades and they realised that some of the, I don't know, the cherry trees were doing better around there than they were around there. But you don't have to chat to Lara about that. But I don't think there's been much change because they manage all that.
Interesting, because I'd heard people have become, they loved it so much, a lot of people that lived there, that they started, planting their own stuff and
I don't know how true
more.
that is. I think that might be some people
wanting it to
speculating
be true.
It, My thing is, because I know it's maintained by one maintenance company under the auspices, and Lara's still involved, if I remember rightly. So I think there may be some Chinese whispers going on there.
Interesting. But that's a really interesting point about the management, because that's often one of the biggest stumbling blocks in the landscape world we come across.
Yeah,
and there have to be more innovative ways to tackle it.
Yeah, well, what's really innovative about that, they realised that if each one of those flats was sold, and within how it was sold, they were then responsible for that, well, they could go in and cut them all down.
Yeah.
So there was a decision that, right, actually, the envelope is managed by the owner.
Yeah.
And obviously, if the residents have got some issues and that, obviously there's right and proper processes. But I think that is really, really cool.
Well, it's very clever.
And it's clever to way to do it.
It's very, very clever,
But, if you go, oh, well, okay, you've got a balcony, it's all your responsibility. Oh, I don't like it.
Well, you just have everyone go in and cut all the trees down straight away, don't you? That's exactly it, yeah.
And, what's really, people see that from a landscape point of view, but it's infrastructure. Because the trees at the top, because you've got to remember, it's very, very tall, and it gets quite cool in the winter, if I remember rightly, the way Lara's saying it to it. So, like, the tree cover at the top is specific to the thermal necessities of the top, and the tree cover at the base is to the specific thermal necessities of the spaces at the bottom. So the whole of the tree cover is designed as a form of insulation and varies at what level you are. So the species selection is not just about what's appropriate from will grow in the right place. It's also what that leaf coverage provides at that level. And so, also when you're at the top, it gets very, very hot in Milan, you need that cooling effect, which will be different if you're at the base. So it's been thought through from completely as a piece of thermal infrastructure as well. If you can think through what that's about. It's not just beautification. In fact, I would have thought Stefano started from what is the function of those trees in terms of the building. Not what they look like. So everybody goes like, it's an idiot. Go on LinkedIn, there's always, always the Moscow Verticale. They go, oh, it's all about making this lovely forest up a side of a building. No, it's about how you cool that building down and insulate it in the winter and make it look beautiful. But the primary starting point was the thermal gain. And that's important to say. Because most people think, oh, it's about making a beautiful green building.
That's it.
It's about how it functions for the interior of that building.
Exactly, and that's how they're approaching it in other countries like Singapore again. Using it for cooling and things. But really interesting. Thanks so much for everything. We really, really appreciate you coming on and spending your time with us and getting us access to this amazing location, incredible views.
Yeah. And you saw the black red star?
We did see the black red star, yeah, amazing.
Didn't get a photograph. Did you get it on
next
camera?
Time.
Maybe.
Maybe next time.
I'll have to watch them, won't I?
Yeah. That's it. Well, cheers, and we'll catch up in the future, hopefully.
Yeah. Over a beer in Birmingham.
Yeah,
Quite Banks.
Brilliant. Make sustainability a priority throughout the design process with a suite of tools built specifically for landscape architecture and design. Vectorworks gives you the freedom to follow your imagination wherever it may lead. With remarkably flexible software that integrates BIM for landscape and GIS workflows, sketch, model, and document in a single tool with the world's most design-centric BIM solution. Discover Vectorworks' landmark and design without limits. Visit vectorworks.net to learn more. I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as I have. If you're interested in finding out more about how we can green the world around us, then maybe check out our episode with Green-Fingered George, where we talk all about horticulture and what you can do in your own gardens, houses, and even on your windowsill. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to friends and colleagues who might be interested. And a massive thank you to all of our sponsors, Marshalls and Vectorworks, for helping with this episode, and to our incredibly kind supporters, Gillian Goodson Design and the Birmingham Botanical Gardens.